to author and historian Peter Vronsky. I've been curious about his work for a while. He's been working with film as well as writing and investigative work, and it's very fascinating. His recent narrative, which looks at the Fenian Invasion in Canada. But prior to that, he's looked at aspects of serial killers, and I'm curious what he'll share tonight. And please welcome Peter Vronsky.
Thanks, Louise. This is my first time I'm doing a reading, which is kind of weird because writing is not really a performance art. You should be reading this by yourselves, someplace in the dark. I am a historian, and I was a filmmaker, and because I found problems with film, you can point a camera only in one direction, and usually it's the wrong direction. What really is happening around you is happening somewhere else, on the way to the airport, as you're eating lunch, as you're charging your batteries. And eventually I accumulated so much stuff kind of in my head that I had to strip it down to the word. Plus I met two serial killers, quite by random, bumped into them, one for about 15 seconds in New York City, 12 years later, another one in Moscow. I had about a 5-minute conversation with him, not knowing either one of them were serial killers. I found out later. And so that also changed my perception of everything that's happening around me. The math of it as well kind of began to disturb me, because anything can happen to you once. Infinite possibilities once. But twice, if you meet two serial killers, there may be 3, maybe 4. Maybe there was one online. Maybe I sat down to one on the bus. Maybe there's a serial killer sitting in this room. As I started exploring the kind of mathematical possibilities of running into two, as a historian, looking at the past, the way the past shapes your future, kind of going through life ass backwards, looking forward, I began to see a broader world. So I'll read a little section from Serial Killers, The Method and Madness of Monsters. This is something called The Silence of the Less Dead. The question I ask, of course, is 80% of all known male serial killers in American history appeared only after 1950. Male and female serial killers, and there are female serial killers out there. 1 in 6 serial killers is a female. Male and female serial killers from 1975 to 1995, a 20-year period, account for 45% of all known serial killers in the United States over a 2-century period. Between 1960 and 1990, serial homicides in the US increased by 940%. So why might that be? And so this is what I write in this little section, The Silence of the Less Dead. Some are suggesting that there are not more serial killers, but more available victims in a social pool in which serial killers like to hunt and troll. Stephen Egger, the project director of New York State Serial Homicide Computer Analysis System, HALT, Homicide Assessment and Lead Tracking System, argues that there is an increasing climate of social encouragement to kill a type of person who, when murdered, is less dead than other categories of homicide victims. Sex workers, cruising gays in promiscuous straits, homeless transients, runaways, public housing tenants, senior citizens, the disabled, indigenous peoples, the diseased and the poor are all perceived by our society as less dead when murdered than, for example, a white college girl from a middle-class suburb or an angel-haired child from an affluent family. Egger says, the victims of serial killers viewed when alive as a devalued strata of humanity become less dead, since for many they were less alive before their death, and now they become the never were. And their demise becomes the elimination of sores or blemishes, cleansed by those who dare to wash away these undesirable elements. The serial murders of 5 University of Florida students in Gainesville in 1990 inspired breathless national coverage on live network television and in print media, while the systematic serial killing of 11 black crack-addicted women in Detroit hardly made page 3 anywhere. Nobody cared, for they were the less dead. When one begins to look through the backgrounds of serial killer victims, one finds that a large proportion of them are indeed marginalized members of our society, about whom few are concerned, and whose deaths some even celebrate. Gary Ridgeway, the recently confessed Green River killer of 48 women, commented to the police, I thought I was doing you guys a favor, killing the prostitutes. Here you guys can't control them, but I can. Only the frequent presence of female college students and children among categories of victims preferred by serial killers does the less dead characterization falter. Traditional law enforcement victimology argues that victims facilitate their own murders by the lifestyle they lead. Obviously, they say, serial killers target prostitutes because they are easy to lure into a car or into a closed room, rather than because of some patriarchal, phallocentric, homicidal hostility towards the figure of an autonomous female daring to sell her body, reluctantly or not, what radical feminists might characterize as femicide or gynocide. The traditionalists argue that the presence of college students and children among preferred serial killer victims is by virtue of the impetuous nature of their youth and proves the victim facilitation model. It's a matter of logistical convenience, not social constructs or socioeconomic marginalization that compels serial killers to prefer certain types of victims over others, they argue. While callousness towards the underprivileged is not new, our popular culture today actually enables the serial murderer to increasingly target the less dead. A serial killing cultural ecology is being defined by news coverage, websites, social media, true crime literature, fiction, movie and television entertainment, gaming and fantasy play, almost all of it focusing on the serial killer's skills in eluding the police and on the nature of his or her acts, while the victims are often mere props in the story, or worse, even justify their own deaths. Stephen Egger, for example, despises the portrayal of the 2 fictional serial killers, Hannibal Lecter and Buffalo Bill, in the iconic movie The Silence of the Lambs, which in the early 1990s essentially introduced into our popular vocabulary both the concept of the serial killer and of the profiler. Egger was appalled that movie audiences identified with the clever, sophisticated, and cultured Dr. Hannibal, the Cannibal Lecter, as played by Anthony Hopkins, and that he became the real star of the movie, not Jodie Foster as FBI apprentice profiler Agent Starling, the intended protagonist of the movie. Egger argues that it was not only the brilliance of Anthony Hopkins that transformed this serial killer from a cruel, sadistic animal into an anti-hero. Indeed, Hopkins' acting skills notwithstanding, the public is pre-programmed to identify with or even laud the role of certain categories of serial killers. The urbane, Chianti-sipping Hannibal Lecter was a good serial killer, while the sexually confused, rural, poverty-ridden, shack-dwelling, pseudo-transsexual Buffalo Bill with the boombox, who kept his victims in a stinking pit and skinned them, was the bad serial killer. Buffalo Bill himself was less alive. As one critic pointed out, many would enjoy the company of the cannibal Dr. Lecter at a dinner party, as long as they weren't on the menu, but who would want to be even seen in public with Buffalo Bill? This kind of social demarcation between acceptable and unacceptable serial murder paves the way for our society to attach a value to the serial killer, raising him in status above ordinary pedestrian murderers who slay their spouses or brawl and shoot their way into a sloppy murder charge. For many, the serial killer is a symbol of courage, individuality, and unique cleverness, a paragon of social self-determination, even a species of globalized American enterprise. Many transform the serial killer into a figure which allows them to fantasize rebellion or the lashing out at society's ills. For others, the serial killer becomes a symbol of swift and effective justice, cleansing society of its crime-ridden vermin. The serial killer's skills in eluding police for long periods of time transcend the very reason for which he's being pursued. The killer's elusiveness overshadows his trail of tears and horror. Sociologist Mark Seltzer argues that in the United States, serial killing has supplanted an earlier, uniquely American cultural institution. He writes, serial murder and its representations have by now largely replaced the Western as the most popular genre of fiction of the body and of bodily violence in our culture. The Western was really about serial killing all along. Seltzer links the popularity of true crime literature, movie of the week crime stories, and news accounts of serial murder to what he calls a wound culture, the public fascination with torn and open bodies and open persons, a collective gathering around shock, trauma, and the wound. This kind of cultural insemination of serial killers is echoed in historian Angus MacLaren's analysis of the 19th century serial murderer Dr. Thomas Neil Crane, who killed 5 women coming to him seeking abortions. MacLaren proposes that his crimes were determined largely by the society that produced them. In Dr. Crane's time and place, in Victorian London, single, pregnant women seeking an abortion were the focus of the most intense scorn and disdain. The serial killer, rather than a homicidal outcast disconnected from society, according to MacLaren, is likely best understood not so much as an outlaw, but as an over-socialized individual who saw himself simply carrying out the sentences that society at large leveled. Mark Seltzer suggests that serial killers today are fed and nurtured in a similar cultural dialogue in which they become addicted to responding with their own homicidal contributions in a process that he calls mimetic compulsion. Or more simply, as once put by Robert Kennedy, society gets the kind of criminal it deserves. There is a creeping rise in indifference, a species of nonchalance towards serial killing, especially if the victims are society's throwaways. The arrest of Gary Ridgeway, the Green River Killer, in his confession in 2003, he actually confessed to 71 murders, convicted for 48. This confession just garnered routine media coverage. Many can identify Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, or Andrew Cunanan. But few people have ever heard of serial killers with names like Kendall Stinky Francois or William Lester Suff, despite their relatively high number of victims. 27-year-old Francois, while living with his parents at home, killed 8 prostitutes from 1996 to 1998 and stored their corpses in the attic. But he and his victims hardly made the news. Francois was doing his killing in Poughkeepsie, New York, a squalid town on the Hudson River halfway between Albany and New York, too far south to enter the Albany television market, too far north to be covered by the New York City TV footprint. That's like saying it never happened. And of course, by the end of 1990s, 8 victims was a really mediocre performance if numbers count for anything. There was no new hook to the story. He wasn't eating his victims or even taking a bite and spitting it out. He was just strangling them and stacking their corpses one by one in plastic garbage bags up in the attic of their African-American small-town working-class house. His parents complained about the smell. Dead raccoons, Stinky Francois told him. Even William Lester Suff, with his 13 victims in the Lake Elsinore region of California from 1986 to 1992, is relatively obscure, having killed again outside the convenient Los Angeles television footprint. Suff killed drug-addicted street hookers and left their bodies behind strip mall garbage dumpsters, posed so as to call attention to their drug habits. But Suff goes on trial in the middle of the O.J. Simpson case. What are 13 dead small-town crack whores compared to 2 shiny Starbucks white victims in Brentwood at the hands of an enraged celebrity? Or how about Joe Rifkin, who murdered 17 street prostitutes in the New York, Long Island area? The media abandoned his story in the rush to cover the deaths of 6 respectably employed suburban train commuters at the hands of Colin Ferguson. The trial of Joe Rifkin was wrapped up in relative obscurity despite the 17 murder victims. We would never have heard of Joe Rifkin if his name had not been made a butt of jokes on an episode of Seinfeld. For the press, covering serial murder these days, it is not the sheer number of snuffed out lives and the victims that count, but their individual celebrity status and visible credit rating. The trade-off comes in at about 1 SUV in the garage for every 5 dead hookers in the dumpster.
Thank you, Peter, for sharing that with us. I'm surprised you don't read more. I think your fiction and these narratives cover things that are much more than fiction. So striking. I hope we're going to go to more or less soon, but before we do that, I just wanted to say many thanks to all of you for joining us for this winter entry of the box. We're continuing as a series, and it'll continue with another installment in probably late June in the summer. Thanks to Mark, because it's not easy to do these mixed evenings, and he's this amazing tech, just as the folks at the Rivoli. When I saw Andre out there earlier, and he said the Rivoli is celebrating its 30th birthday soon, I thought, like, how wonderful, and he was downplaying it. But it's actually rare to have spaces like this in the city now, where increasingly you have to pay, and you have to pay dearly to do anything culturally within a club environment. But the Rivoli is like a gem for that, for letting us do this and other events, and so many continued commitment to local artists, even as the Queen Street community has changed so much. So many thanks, of course, to this place and the folks in here. And I wanted to just, again, thank all of you and all of our supporters. Thanks to Mike for helping at the door and Raymond for helping to document, and all of you.